Hello everyone, this is Micah History, and welcome to part 3 where we are going over the famous ancestors of King Charles. So for those of you who have not watched the previous videos or don't really know what this series is about, go watch my first video in the series. Essentially the point being that I am looking at what the king's DNA results would look like if he took a DNA test, and then basically going through some of his famous ancestors to understand where some of his genetic history comes from. But go watch that video if you want more details, and of course watch part 1 and part 2 if you want, but you do not strictly need those to understand this video. With that out of the way, let's get to it. So one of Charles's most famous ancestors is Frederick I, Holy Roman Emperor, also known as Frederick Barbarossa. He succeeded his father Frederick II as Duke of Swabia in 1147 until 1152, after which he became King of Arles in Germany. 3 years later, he was crowned as King of Italy on the 24th of April in Pavia and Holy Roman Emperor on the 18th of June by Pope Adrian IV in Rome. In 1156, he also became Count of Burgundy, and the next year the name Holy Roman Empire first appeared in the historical records. He was one of the greatest rulers of the time, being ambitious, organized, a great warrior, and a politician alike. He also ruled for almost 40 years until his death during the Third Crusade in 1190. However, Frederick was actually only 31.25% German, with the rest being 20.25% French, 17% Dutch, 6% Lombard, 5% Norse, 4% Hungarian, 3.5% Sorb, 3% Emilian, 2.25% Greek, 1.5% Bulgarian, 1.5% Breton, 1.5% Italian, 1% English, 0.75% Cuman, 0.75% Polish, and 0.5% Czech. So you can see that Frederick Barbarossa actually had ancestry from pretty much all of Europe. Now, just as important though was Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, who became King of Sicily only 8 years later in 1198 at the age of 4. In 1212 he became Duke of Swabia, King of Germany and King of Italy, although he was succeeded by Henry VII of Germany as Duke of Swabia 4 years later. Nevertheless, by 1215 he was uncontested as King of Germany. Finally, in 1220 he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. Nevertheless, after this high point, he soon became bitter enemies with the Pope, just as Henry IV before him. It got so bad that he got excommunicated on 3 separate occasions and was even called the Antichrist by Pope Gregory IX. Despite this, he was even able to become King of Jerusalem in 1225 during the Sixth Crusade, although he lost that title only 3 years later. At his Sicilian court in Palermo, he became a major patron of arts, science, literature, and poetry, and encouraged works in Sicilian instead of Latin, which would have a major influence on Italian later on. After a remarkable reign, he died in 1250, after which the Holy Roman Empire would experience a long and slow decline. Now, he was just under half French, actually, being only a quarter German, and was also 13.25% Dutch, 3.5% Lombard, 3% Ligurian, 10%, 2% Norse, 1.5% Sorb, 1% Norwegian, Swedish, Hungarian, and Sorb, 0.75% Emilian, Breton, and English, 0.5% Bulgarian, 0.5% Italian, and 0.25% Occitan, East Slavic, Polish, and Cuban. So, quite mixed as well. Now, an earlier king of Sicily of importance was Roger II of Sicily, who was its first king. He became Count of Sicily in 1105 at age 10. In 1127, he became Duke of Apulia and Calabria, and the next year he became Prince of Taranto. Finally, in 1130, he elevated Sicily to a kingdom and was succeeded by his son as Prince of Taranto 2 years later, and another of his sons as Duke of Apulia and Calabria 2 years after that. His main achievement was consolidating the different Norman countries in Italy under one government, which had been done by his death in 1154. Now, because he was Norman, he was mostly French at 64.25%, but was also an 8th Ligurian, 7.75% Lombard, 7.5% Dutch, 2.5% Norse, 1.5% Greek, and 1.5% Sorb, 1% Occitan, 0.75% East Slavic, and 0.75% German. But after all, Charles is still a British king, and so let's head back to England. So another major ancestor of his is Henry I of England, the 4th son of William the Conqueror. After William's death, his 2 brothers inherited his land, with Robert Curthose becoming Duke of Normandy and William II becoming King of England. Suspiciously, he was present right when his brother William died in a hunting so-called accident in 1100, after which he became the king. Robert invaded the next year in order to dispute the coronation, but eventually accepted Henry as king, but only for a while, because in 1105 and 1106, Henry did a reverse Uno card and actually invaded Normandy, imprisoning Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray. However, his troubles didn't end, as Louis VI of France, among others, supported Robert's son, William Clito, as a pretender to the throne, and only crushed his rebellion in 1119. Now, Henry's bad luck continued, as the next year his son William died in the White Ship disaster while crossing the Channel. And although he took another wife, he had no more children. Because of this, he declared his daughter Matilda as his heir, and he died in 1135. Now, this interesting man was 53.5% French, 23.5% Dutch, 8.25% German, 6.25% Breton, 4.25% Occitan, 1.5% Norse, 1% Lombard, 0.5% Greek and Armenian, and was only 0.75% English. Now, however, it would be that Matilda wouldn't actually succeed her father as queen, since her title was disputed by her cousin Stephen, who I already mentioned. Go back to episode 1 for that, because he was backed by the church and the nobility. In 1139, she crossed into England to take it by force, supported by David I of Scotland, and even captured Stephen 2 years later. But her attempt to get crowned at Westminster failed due to bitter opposition from the people, and so because of this, she was titled Lady of the English instead of Queen. That winter, she was trapped in Oxford Castle by Stephen's army, and in order to avoid capture, had to cross the frozen Thames River at night. After a long stalemate in 1148, she gave up and returned to Normandy, leaving her son Henry to continue the campaign, and finally dying in 1167. She was roughly a quarter French, a quarter English, and a quarter Scottish, and was also an eighth Dutch, 4% German, 3% Breton, 2% Occitan, 1.5% Irish, 0.75% Norse, 0.5% Lombard, and 0.25% Greek and Armenian. Now, Henry II, he was appointed Duke of Normandy in 1150 by Louis VII of France, and the following year became Count of Anjou and Maine after his father's death. In 1152, he became Duke of Aquitaine along with his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had actually been King Louis's former wife. Continuing his mother's war against Stephen to claim the throne, they made a settlement in 1153 at the Treaty of Wallingford, and the following year Stephen died, making Henry the uncontested King of England. As king, he consolidated his conquest of Wales, as well as his territory in Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. However, his attempt to reform the relationship between church and state led to arguments with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and ended with his murder in 1170. He also had conflicts with Louis VII of France, which resulted in his conquest of Brittany and advances into central and southern France. However, France struck back by supporting his son's rebellions against him, led by Henry the young king and his brother Richard and Geoffrey in 1173. They were also supported by Scotland, Flanders, Brittany, and Boulogne. Although the rebellion was crushed, young Henry rebelled again 10 years later, which resulted in his death. However, in order to not anger the rest of his sons, Henry invaded Ireland to give land to his son, John. However, his children still were not satisfied, and by 1189, young Henry and Geoffrey were dead, but Richard was still unsatisfied, and along with King Philip II of France's help, he defeated his father and became king, with Henry dying not long after. Henry was 59.25% French, was actually an eighth English, which is a lot more than any of his previous rulers, an eighth Scottish, 7.25% Dutch, 5% German, 1.5% Breton, 1% Occitan, 0.75% Irish, 0.5% Norse, and 0.25% Lombard. Now, his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine is probably just as important as he was, and she became Duchess of Aquitaine and Countess of Poitiers at age 15 after her father's death. 3 months later, she married Louis, the son of King Louis VI of France, and only days later he succeeded his father as King of France. As queen, she participated in the Second Crusade, but soon after tried to divorce Louis, which was rejected by Pope Eugene III. However, Louis himself eventually agreed after 15 years of marriage because they couldn't have a son, and they separated in 1152. However, only days later she became engaged to Henry, the Duke of Normandy, and married less than 2 months later, becoming Queen of England in 1154. However, even this marriage didn't go well, and she was imprisoned in 1173 for supporting young Henry's rebellion, and wouldn't be released until Richard succeeded his father as king. Although no longer queen, she lived until 1204 as a powerful patron of literary figures. He was 83% French, 11.75% Dutch, 4.75% German, 0.25% Lombard, and was only 0.25% English. Another famous woman of this time was Urraca of Leon and Castile. After the death of her father, Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, she succeeded him in 1109 as Queen of Castile, Leon, and Galicia, and claimed the title of Empress of all Spain. Although she never came close to ruling the entire peninsula, she's notable for being the first woman to rule in her own right in Europe and did so until her death in 1126. Despite being from Spain, she was actually 40.75% French, and the rest being 15.5% Aragonese, 15% Galician, 8.25% Basque, 6.5% Leonese, 6.5% Dutch, only 4.5% Spanish, 2% German, and 0.5% Greek and Armenian. Now, one of the most infamous kings of this time was John, who had been the first Lord of Ireland when his brother Richard I died in 1199, and he succeeded him as King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Maine, Duke of Aquitaine, and Count of Poitou. Although at first he signed the Treaty of Le Goulet in 1200 with King Philip II, in which Philip recognized John's authority over much of France. They went to war only 2 years later, and due to a lack of resources and his treatment of French nobles, he lost his territory in Poitou, Normandy, and Maine in 1204, although he did become Count of Angoulême. He spent much of the next decade trying to reconquer his lands by creating alliances, raising money, and reforming the judicial system. He tried to defeat Philip in 1214, but after Philip's defeat of his allies at Bouvines, he failed and faced a rebellion known as the First Barons' War. This led to the signing of the famous Magna Carta in 1215, which was an early step in the Constitution of the United Kingdom, and for the first time limited the king's rights, although it would take a while before this treaty was actually followed. During the war, he died of dysentery in 1216. Now, he was 71% French, 9.5% Dutch, only 6.5% English, 6% Scottish, 5% German, 0.75% Breton, 0.5% Irish, 0.5% Occitan, and 0.25% Norse. Now, while John is often considered one of, if not the worst English kings, next door in Wales, Llywelyn ab Iorwerth was ruling as King of Gwynedd, starting in 1195 when he succeeded his uncle. He was able to secure the support and eventually the daughter of King John. However, Llywelyn's relationship with his father-in-law soon deteriorated, leading them to war in 1211, in which Llywelyn lost all land east of the River Conwy, but later made an alliance with other Welsh princes and recorded the territory. As a further insult, he allied with the barons who forced John to sign the Magna Carta. By 1216, he had become the dominant Welsh prince and held a council to distribute lands to the other princes. Llywelyn spent the rest of his reign successfully defending his land against English forces, eventually resulting in the Peace of the Middle in 1234 and a stable Wales at his death in 1240. Due to his domination of Wales and his successful defense of the land against English invasion, he is now known as Llywelyn the Great. Although he was obviously overwhelmingly Welsh, ironically enough, he was actually 33% English as well.